The 73rd suitor left before the sun crossed the courtyard wall. Elindra watched him go from the balcony above. Her fingers curled against the stone railing, one hand steady and the other, the scarred one, the one that would not open past a half fist pressed flat against the cool surface, as if the wall itself could lend her what her own body would not. She counted his steps. 14 across the inner court, 6 down the broad stairs, and then he was in his shuttle, and then he was a contrail above the Vethani mountains, and then he was nothing at all. Below, her mother's senior advisor counselor Draven turned from the courtyard gate and looked up. He did not need to speak. His expression said it plainly. Another one gone, Your Highness. Another season without a match. The 73rd. She pulled back from the railing before he could add the look she hated most, the one that mixed pity with quiet satisfaction, as though each failed courtship proved a thesis he had been building for years. He had been building it, she knew. Draven had served the ascendancy for 30 cycles. He had watched Elindra's elder sister Melis train for the throne, had built his council strategies around Melis' strengths, had invested decades of political capital in a future that died under a Korathi artillery beam in a field hospital on the northern border. Now he was left with the second heir, the spare, the one nobody had groomed, the one with a crushed hand and a habit of asking questions instead of accepting answers. She understood why he resented her. She simply refused to let the understanding soften into surrender. In another time, 3 cycles before this one, when the war had not yet scarred the northern provinces and her hand had not yet been destroyed in the rubble of that collapsing hospital, Elindra had believed the courtships would end differently. She had been the second heir of the Vethani ascendancy, tall and sharp-featured, and unburdened by the crown's weight. Her skin was the pale ivory of mountain-born Vethani, her ears tapering to elegant points above the dark fall of her copper-red hair, and her eyes deep gold, wide-set, luminous in the way her people prized, had drawn 3 offers of alliance before her 20th cycle. She had been proud then, in the clean way of someone who had earned nothing and assumed everything, and the pride had tasted like certainty. Then the Korathi bombardment changed the northern sky to fire. Then the field hospital where she had been volunteering as a logistics aide collapsed around her, beams and stone, and the terrible grinding sound of a structure failing. Then her elder sister Melis, who had been there too, because Melis never sent others into danger she would not face herself, died pinned beneath the same crossbeam that caught Elindra's right hand and crushed it past surgical recovery. Now she was the first heir, the only heir, and the hand that should hold a consort's wrist at the coronation altar could not hold a stylus. Draven had been clinical about the math. The ascendancy needed an alliance marriage to stabilize the post-war provinces. The allied houses would not bind their sons to a princess who could not perform the binding clasp, the ancient ritual interlocking of hands that sealed a Vethani royal union. Without the clasp, there was no marriage. Without a marriage, there was no alliance. Without an alliance, the border provinces would fracture, and the ceasefire with the Korathi would collapse under the weight of unsupported reconstruction. 73 suitors had come. Each one had been vetted by Draven's office, approved by the council, presented in the formal courtship chamber with the correct protocols and the correct offerings and the correct diplomatic language. Each one had examined the scarred hand, some openly, some with practiced subtlety, and departed with murmurs about timing and priorities and perhaps next season. Perhaps next season. The phrase had become its own kind of artillery. Elindra descended from the balcony and walked the east corridor toward her study, passing the row of tall windows that showed the Kale Pass, the ancient mountain route that wound down through granite teeth to the lowland settlements, where the war's refugees had gathered in camps that were supposed to be temporary and had become something worse. Far below, she could see the trade road, a thin scar on the mountain's face, and on it a column of figures moving upward. More refugees, she guessed. The Korathi ceasefire was holding in name, but the border provinces were still emptying. People flowed downhill like water through a cracked pipe, seeking lower ground, seeking safety, seeking anything that was not the shattered landscape they had left behind. Her aide Tessavar was waiting in the study with a tablet, and the expression of someone delivering news they expected to be ignored. "The human delegation has arrived at the lower gate," Tessavar said. She was young for a royal aide, barely past her second decade, but she had a sharp mind and a talent for saying difficult things without ornament. "The one your mother approved for the reconstruction contracts. 6 engineers and a project lead." Elindra sat down, flexing her damaged hand beneath the desk where Tessavar could not see the effort it cost. The fingers responded sluggishly, curling inward like something afraid of the light. "Details." The project lead requested an audience with the first heir to discuss the northern water infrastructure. Counselor Draven denied the request. "On what grounds?" "He said you were occupied with courtship obligations, and that the reconstruction contract was a trade matter under his jurisdiction." Elindra looked at the empty courtship chair across her study. The ornate seat, carved from mountain oak and inlaid with silver wire in the traditional pattern, where suitors sat while she made conversation, and they tried not to stare at her hand. The chair had been empty for 11 days now. The 73rd suitor had stayed only long enough to review the medical briefing Draven's office provided to all candidates. "The courtship chair is currently unoccupied," Elindra said. "I told Draven that. And he said humans have no standing to request an audience with Vethani royalty outside of trade matters. His exact words were, 'The human may submit a written summary through my office, as protocol requires.'" Elindra filed this. Draven had been consolidating authority since her mother's illness worsened 3 months ago. Small denials, redirected petitions, audiences quietly blocked, supply requests routed through layers of approval that had not existed a year earlier, each one defensible on its own. All of them taken together, a wall built from procedural stone, closing around her authority the way the rubble had closed around her hand. "What do we know about this project lead?" Tessavar checked her notes. Name, Cole Vasic, former military engineer, served 14 years in the Terran Boundary Corps, frontier infrastructure not combat, age 41, mustered out after the Terran drawdown 3 years ago, moved into private reconstruction work, requested the audience to discuss structural assessments of the northern aqueduct system. She paused. Draven's office classified it as routine infrastructure maintenance. "Is it routine?" "The northern aqueduct feeds 3 refugee settlements and the Kale Pass garrison. Combined population, 11,000. If the system fails before winter, we lose the settlements, we lose the garrison, and we lose control of the pass. Draven's engineers assessed the system as stable 6 months ago." "Then why does a human contractor want to discuss it with me, instead of filing a written summary?" Tessavar's expression shifted, a careful neutrality that meant she had an opinion she was choosing not to voice. "Schedule the audience," Elindra said. "My authority, not Draven's." 3 years later, she would remember that moment as the first time she chose to push back against the wall. She did not know yet that the wall would fight back with everything it had, or that the human climbing the mountain with a survey kit and a quiet voice would become the reason she stopped counting departures and started counting the things that stayed. But that came later. Cole Vasic was not what Elindra expected. She had met humans before, trade envoys, mostly, polished and careful and aware of every protocol. 2 had visited during the courtship cycle, cultural liaisons sent by the Terran consulate to discuss potential cross-species union frameworks, and they had been so meticulously diplomatic that the conversations felt like reading legal documents aloud. Vasic walked into her study the next morning with stone dust on his boots, a survey tube under one arm, and a face that looked like the mountain had been working on it for 40 years. Dark hair shot with gray at the temples, though the gray seemed earned rather than aged. A jaw that had been broken at least once and had healed slightly off-center, giving his face an asymmetry that should have been a flaw but instead read as structure. The way an old bridge looks more honest than a new one because you can see where it has carried weight. Steady dark eyes that assessed the room the way an engineer assessed a load-bearing wall, structurally, not socially. He stopped at the correct distance. She noticed that. He knew the protocol or had been briefed and inclined his head. Not a bow, which would have been wrong for his rank, and not the stiff nod most humans offered when uncertain. Something between, respectful without performing respect. "Your Highness." His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of someone who measured twice. "Thank you for the audience. I understand Counselor Draven preferred I work through his office." "Counselor Draven prefers many things," Elindra said. "The water system, show me your assessment." Vasek unslung the survey tube, pulled out a set of rolled schematics, and spread them on her desk without asking permission. She noticed that too, not rudeness, but the directness of someone who understood that a cracking aqueduct did not wait for ceremony. "The northern aqueduct has 3 fracture points," he said, tracing the lines with a blunt finger. The finger was scarred across the knuckle, work scars, not war scars, the kind earned from years of hands-on construction. "Here, at the junction below Settlement 2. Here at the bend where the channel passes through the granite shelf, and here at the main feed above the Kale garrison." Draven's engineers assessed the system as stable. Draven's engineers assessed it from the access points on top. Standard surface inspection. I climbed down inside the channel itself. He looked up from the schematics, and his eyes met hers without flinching, without the careful calibration she saw in every counselor and every suitor who entered this room. The inside tells a different story. The Korathi bombardment didn't hit the aqueduct directly, but the concussion waves displaced the foundation anchors along a 3-kilometer stretch. The pipe is holding on residual tension. The old masonry is strong enough to resist slow movement, but not strong enough to survive thermal cycling. First hard freeze, the tension releases. The pipe snaps at all 3 fracture points simultaneously. Elindra studied the diagrams. She had been trained in military logistics before the war, supply chains, infrastructure dependencies, resource allocation under constraint. Her hand was damaged, not her mind, and she could read structural stress patterns well enough to know that what Vasek was showing her was not a maintenance issue. It was a countdown. How long to repair? If I have materials and a full crew of 24 months. If Draven's office routes the material requisition through standard procurement channels, competitive bidding, council review, supplier certification, 8 months. The freeze comes in 5. You're asking me to bypass my own counselor's procurement process. I'm telling you the math, Your Highness. He rolled the schematics carefully, his hands precise and unhurried even when the subject was urgent. 3 settlements, 11,000 refugees, 1 aqueduct, 5 months. The math does not care about procurement channels. She watched his hands strong, scarred across the knuckles, sure of their purpose. She realized she had been unconsciously hiding her own damaged hand beneath the desk, curling the scarred fingers into the shadow of her lap. She had done it so many times with so many visitors that the motion was automatic, a reflex as ingrained as breathing. She made herself stop. She placed both hands on the desk surface, the good one and the ruined one, side by side. Vasek's gaze dropped to her hands for exactly 1 second. The scarred right hand with its permanent half-fist, the swollen knuckles, the scar tissue pulling the fingers inward. 1 second. Then his gaze returned to her face. His expression did not change. It was the smallest thing she had ever felt break something open inside her. 1 second of looking and then not looking again. No pity, no diplomatic glance away. No careful avoidance, no the princess's tragic injury expression she had learned to read on 73 different faces. He saw the hand, registered it the way he registered a crack in a wall, and moved on, because the aqueduct mattered more than her scars. 73 suitors had failed to do what this human did in 1 second of honest attention. "You'll have your materials," Elindra said. "I'll authorize the requisition directly." "Thank you, Your Highness." He gathered his schematics and turned toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. The pass road needs grading too. The refugees are climbing loose scree above a 300-meter drop. The path hasn't been maintained since the war. Someone's going to fall. Add it to your scope. He nodded once, that same between gesture, honest without being familiar, and was gone. Draven came to her study within the hour. She had been expecting him. His intelligence network within the palace was thorough. He likely knew about the audience before Vasek had finished climbing the stairs. "You authorized a material requisition outside my office." His voice was controlled, the anger beneath it tightly managed beneath 30 years of courtly discipline. Draven was Vethani old guard, tall, silver-haired, immaculate in the formal gray of a senior counselor, every seam pressed, every button aligned. He had served her mother for 3 decades, and he carried that service like a structural beam, load-bearing and immovable. "I did." The human engineer has no standing to bypass established channels. If every contractor could walk into the first air study and demand resources outside of proper procedure, the entire reconstruction framework collapses. He didn't demand. He showed me structural data that contradicts your engineer's assessment. The aqueduct is failing. 3 fracture points, all critical. He climbed inside and found displacement your surface inspections missed. My engineers are certified Vethani structural specialists with decades of. Your engineers assessed from the top. Vasek climbed inside. His data is better. Draven's mouth thinned. She could see the calculation behind his eyes, whether to escalate now or retreat and regroup. He chose the middle path, the one that left doors open. "Your Highness, with respect, the human delegation is here for reconstruction labor. They are contractors, bound by the terms of their engagement. Their access to royal authority should be limited to the scope of their contract." Limited by whom? The question hung between them like a crack in a load-bearing wall. Draven heard what she was really asking: who decides the limits now? And she watched him calculate whether the wall he had built around her authority was strong enough to hold this particular pressure. He retreated. "I will review the structural data myself." "Do that. And Draven, the next time a contractor requests an audience with me, route it through Tessivar, not through your office. The reconstruction is under my authority." He left without the customary acknowledgement. A small thing, but Elindra noticed it the way Vasek noticed hairline cracks as evidence of structural stress. She sat alone in her study and flexed her damaged hand, open and closed, feeling the pull of scar tissue and the ache of muscles that would never fully respond. She thought about the way Vasek had looked at her hand for 1 second and then returned to the work. 1 second. Not 0, which would have been avoidance. Not 3 or 4, which would have been study or pity. 1 second. The exact duration of honest recognition. She thought about the 73 who had looked and never come back. The dual timelines of Elindra's memory would always overlay each other after that. The present work, and the past refusals running side by side like the twin channels of the aqueduct Vasek was trying to save. In the present, the repair work began. Vasek's crew of 6 humans and 14 Vethani laborers started at the highest fracture point, working down the mountain in the narrowing autumn light. Elindra received weekly reports, dry, precise, stripped of everything except measurements and material needs and completion percentages. No rhetoric, no politics, no hedging. She found herself reading them more carefully than she read Draven's council briefings, which were longer and said less. In the past, surfacing at odd moments, triggered by a word or a gesture, she remembered the courtships. Not the suitors themselves, who had blurred into a procession of diplomatic smiles and averted eyes, but the architecture of rejection. The way each courtship had been structured to appear mutual. The careful language. We find the timing unfavorable. The alliance priorities have shifted. The binding clasp requirement presents complexities. Complexities, the word they used for a hand that would not open. The 29th suitor had been the worst. A minor prince from the Selvan Reach, young and handsome, and so carefully briefed that he had managed to avoid looking at her hand for 3 full days. On the 4th day, during a formal dinner, he had reached across the table to offer the traditional Vethani greeting, palm extended, fingers open, an invitation to clasp. Elindra had placed her right hand in his. The scarred fingers had opened as far as they could, which was barely a third of the way. The young prince had looked down at the hand in his, and something had moved across his face, not cruelty, but the involuntary recoil of someone touching something they had not expected to feel. He had released her hand gently, finished the meal with impeccable courtesy, and departed the next morning with a note about family obligations. That one she remembered, the rest were variations on the same theme. She visited the worksite for the first time in the 3rd week. Vasek was waist-deep in a trench, his hands black with pipe sealant, directing 2 Vethani workers on the placement of a foundation anchor. He saw her approaching and climbed out, wiping his hands on a rag that was already far past saving. "Your Highness, I wasn't expecting a site visit." "It's not an inspection. I wanted to see the fracture points myself." He studied her for a moment, that structural assessment again, reading load-bearing walls, and then nodded without further comment. "Follow me." He led her down into the aqueduct channel itself, a narrow stone corridor carved into the mountain's face centuries ago by Vethani masons, whose craft had since been lost to war and time. The walls were smooth granite, fitted without mortar in the old way, and the water, diverted temporarily through an emergency bypass, had left mineral deposits that glittered blue and amber in the portable lights Vasek's crew had strung along the passage. They walked in silence for several minutes, the channel narrowing as it descended. Elindra noticed that Vasek adjusted his pace to hers without making a show of it, not slowing down conspicuously, just matching her stride as though their natural rhythms happened to align. She noticed because every suitor had either walked too fast, proving vigor, or too slow, demonstrating deference, and both had felt like performances. Here, he stopped at a point where the wall showed a hairline crack running from floor to ceiling. To an untrained eye it looked like nothing, a single thread in a tapestry of stone. Vasek placed his palm flat against the wall beside the crack. "Put your hand here." She placed her good hand against the wall. She felt it immediately, a faint vibration, a tremor running through the stone like a pulse in a living thing. "The concussion energy from the bombardment is still propagating through the bedrock," Vasek said. "The mountain is settling. Slowly, millimeters per month, but it's settling. That crack has widened by a full millimeter since I first measured it 3 weeks ago." A millimeter doesn't sound significant. A millimeter in granite is a scream. This stone was fitted by masons who worked to tolerances of 1/10 of a millimeter. A full millimeter means the foundation has shifted enough to break the original compression lock. Once the lock breaks, the pipe separates at the joint, and the water goes into the mountain instead of through it. Elindra kept her palm against the vibrating stone. The tremor was subtle but persistent, like the heartbeat of something wounded. "How much time do we have?" "Before the freeze, maybe. Before the first heavy rain, I'm less sure. Rain adds hydraulic pressure to the fractured sections. It could accelerate the failure by weeks." She looked at the crack and felt the mountain trembling beneath her palm. She thought of the 11,000 refugees above, drinking water that flowed through a system held together by ancient masonry and the stubborn patience of stone. "What do you need?" "Another crew. Reinforcement struts rated for seismic load. The ones I specified in the original requisition. not the lower-grade substitutes Draven's procurement office tried to approve, and someone with enough authority to tell Draven's supply chain to stop sitting on my material requests. I'll handle Draven. Vasek looked at her, and for the second time his eyes dropped to her scarred hand, the one pressed against her side, fingers curled in their permanent half-fist. This time the look lasted 2 seconds instead of 1. And this time something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not the diagnostic assessment of a suitor evaluating a prospective bride. Recognition. "You know what it's like," he said quietly, "to hold something together when the cracks are already spreading." It was not a question. It was not a compliment. It was not the kind of carefully constructed dignity offering that her advisors might have scripted. It was a simple statement of fact from one person who held damaged things together to another. Elindra's throat tightened. She swallowed it down because that was what she did. She swallowed things down. She pressed them against stone walls. She refused to break. "Yes," she said, "I do." She left the channel and climbed back to the surface, and the autumn wind hit her face like a sentence she had not expected to hear. The weeks that followed compressed time in a way Elindra had not experienced since the war. The urgency of the repair work consumed the palace's attention, drawing resources and focus away from the courtship cycle and the council's political maneuvering and towards something that mattered in the simplest, most structural way: water flowing through stone to keep people alive. Vasek worked 18-hour days in the aqueduct channel. His crew expanded to 24/6 humans and 18 Vethani laborers, the latter drawn from the refugee settlements themselves. Elindra authorized the local hiring over Draven's objection that unlicensed refugee workers posed a liability risk. Vasek had shrugged at the objection. "They're strong, they're motivated, and they know the mountain. License them after the pipe is fixed. Or don't. The pipe doesn't check credentials." She found herself reorganizing her schedule to visit the site every 3rd day. Not for inspection, she told herself, but because the weekly reports did not capture the texture of the work. The sound of hammers ringing in stone corridors, the smell of sealant and wet granite, the way Vasek's crew moved around each other with the wordless efficiency of people who had learned to trust each other's competence in the narrow space between a deadline and a disaster. She noticed things, small things accumulating. The way Vasek spoke to his Vethani laborers, directly, without the elaborate honorifics most off-worlders adopted when addressing a species they did not fully understand, but not rudely either. Simply, plainly. "You're stronger than this beam, use that. The conduit needs to seat flush, feel it with your fingers, not your eyes." The way the laborers responded, startled at first by a human who treated them as peers rather than curiosities, then pleased, then quietly loyal. She overheard 2 of them talking during a shift change. One said, "He works harder than any off-worlder I've met." The other said, "He works harder than any Vethani I've met." The way Vasek ate his meals sitting on whatever surface was nearest to his work. A stone ledge, an overturned crate, the edge of a trench. Never at a separate table, never making a production of rank or species, never requesting the accommodations his contract entitled him to. When Tessevar offered to arrange a private dining space for the human crew lead, Vasek had looked at her with genuine confusion. "I eat where I work. Saves time." The way he treated silence. Most people who entered Elindra's presence filled the air with words, courtiers with flattery, suitors with carefully rehearsed conversation, counselors with positions and proposals. Vasek was comfortable with silence the way the mountain was comfortable with stone. When he had nothing useful to say, he said nothing, and the absence of performance was its own kind of statement. She noticed that he never asked about her hand. Every suitor had asked, some within the first minutes, the blunt ones, who wanted to assess whether the binding clasp was truly impossible or merely difficult. Some waited hours, circling the subject with diplomatic care before finally arriving at the question they had been carrying since they walked through the gate. "Can you perform the ritual? Will your hand open enough? What did the surgeon say about recovery? Is there a prosthetic option? One had suggested, with extraordinary diplomatic delicacy, that certain Terran medical technologies might restore partial function, and that perhaps a joint investment in treatment could serve as the foundation for an alliance. Elindra had recognized the offer for what it was, a negotiation disguised as care, and declined it with matching diplomatic precision. Vasek never asked. He never pointedly looked away from the hand, either no careful avoidance, no deliberate not noticing that would have been its own kind of notice. He simply treated it as a fact of her body, the way the fracture in the aqueduct wall was a fact of the mountain, present, acknowledged, worked around when necessary, and fundamentally irrelevant to the question of whether the person in front of him was competent. Somewhere in the fourth week, Elindra stopped hiding the hand when he was in the room. She did not make a decision about it. She simply noticed, one afternoon during a site briefing, that both her hands were resting on the table, visible, and that she had not tucked the scarred one away. The realization hit her with a small, private shock. The shock of finding that a reflex she had carried for 3 years had quietly stopped firing. The night before the first heavy rain was forecast, Elindra was in her study reviewing supply manifests when Tessevar brought a message from Draven's office. The counselor had delayed the final shipment of reinforcement struts. The stated reason: procurement audit required before release of materials to non-Vethani contractors. Pending review timeline, 14 days. Elindra read the message twice. The rain would hit in 12 hours. The struts were the last components needed to secure fracture point 2, the most vulnerable section, the one where the millimeter crack had widened to 3 millimeters in the past week. She stood, pulled on her heavy coat, and walked down the mountain to the work site in the dark. The path was steep and poorly lit, the same path the refugees climbed daily, the one Vasek had graded and stabilized with retaining stones his crew had cut from local quarry stock. Even improved, it was not a path designed for a princess walking alone at night. She did not care. She had walked worse paths in the dark during the war, carrying supply manifests to positions that were under fire, and the memory of those walks lived in her legs the way the memory of the field hospital lived in her hand. Vasek was in the aqueduct channel with 2 workers, shoring up the weakest section of fracture point 2 with temporary braces made from salvaged beam stock, inferior material, meant to hold days rather than decades, but the best he had. The portable lights threw sharp shadows across the wet stone. Water was already seeping through the widening crack. The upstream rain had started earlier than forecast. "The struts aren't coming," Elindra said from the channel entrance. Vasek looked up. His face was streaked with stone dust and sealant, the lines around his eyes deepened by exhaustion and work-like glare. "When?" Draven blocked them, procurement audit. 14-day review. Vasek was silent for 3 full seconds, long enough for the water to drip twice from the ceiling, each drop landing on the stone floor with the precision of a metronome counting down. Then he set down his tools carefully, the way he did everything, and walked toward her. In the narrow channel, with the lights behind him casting his shadow long against the ancient stonework, he looked like something carved from the mountain itself. Weathered, immovable, patient in the way stone is patient, bearing weight without complaint. "How much time do we have before the full rain hits?" 6 to 8 hours, according to the weather station at Settlement 1. He looked past her, up the channel toward the fracture point. She could see him running calculations, material strength against hydraulic pressure against temperature against time. The same kind of math he had laid out in her study on the first day, but faster now, stripped of schematics and formality, operating on the compressed logic of a man who had spent 14 years building things in places where failure meant people died. "I can hold it," he said. "Not with struts. With what we have, beam stock, emergency sealant, manual compression. But I need to stay in the channel through the night to monitor the braces, and I need someone to open the emergency bypass valve from the control room above. The valve diverts water away from this section so we can work dry. It's a manual override. The automated system was damaged in the bombardment, and nobody's repaired it. Tell me about the valve. Heavy iron wheel, original construction, pre-war. Requires a full two-handed grip and sustained counterclockwise rotation to open. Has to stay open as long as we're working. If it closes, the water hits the unsealed fracture point and we lose everything we've done tonight. He said it without inflection, without looking at her scarred hand, without making it a test or a statement or a kindness. He said it because it was the math. The valve required 2 hands, and he needed all of his people in the channel, and the math did not care about her scars any more than it cared about procurement audits. Elindra looked at the valve control diagram he pulled up on his tablet. The wheel was exactly as he described. Heavy manual override, mounted in a control chamber above the channel, accessible by a narrow stone staircase. Designed for two-handed operation by a Vethani maintenance worker with full manual dexterity. Her left hand could grip it. Her right hand, the scarred one, the half-fist, the hand that would not open, would need to wrap around an iron spoke and hold under sustained rotational load. "I'll manage," she said. "I know you will." 3 words. Said the way he said everything quietly without performance as a fact of engineering rather than encouragement. "I know you will. Not I believe in you. Not you're stronger than you think. Just, I know you will." The way he would say, "I know the beam will hold," because he had checked the load rating, and the numbers were sound. She climbed to the control room, a small stone chamber above the aqueduct channel, accessible by 27 narrow stairs cut into the living rock. The chamber was cold, smelling of old iron and wet stone. The valve wheel was exactly as the diagram showed. Heavy, crusted with mineral deposits, the iron spokes worn smooth by generations of Vethani hands. Elindra placed her left hand on the wheel, solid grip, no problem. Then she placed her right hand beside it. The scarred fingers protested immediately, the tendons pulling against scar tissue, the half-fist straining to open enough to wrap around the iron spoke. The knuckles, fused in their swollen positions, ground against each other as she forced the hand wider. Pain lanced up her forearm, sharp and bright, the specific pain of tissue being asked to do what it had been rebuilt to refuse. She gripped. The wheel did not turn. She adjusted her stance, lowered her center of gravity the way the military logistics instructors had taught her years ago, before the bombardment, before the hospital, before the hand, and pulled. Her right hand screamed. The scar tissue stretched. Something deep in her wrist shifted, not breaking, but realigning, the way a frozen mechanism finally moves when enough steady pressure replaces the bursts of force that accomplish nothing. The wheel turned. Water roared through the bypass channel. She heard it thundering through stone below, felt the vibration in the floor, in the walls, in her bones. Down in the main channel, Vasek and his crew would be working in the suddenly dry corridor, sealing the fracture point with everything they had, racing the clock before the rain overwhelmed the bypass capacity. She held the valve open. Minutes became an hour. The hour became 2. Her left hand ached. Her right hand passed through pain and into the dull, distant territory beyond, where the body simply does what it is told because the alternative is the death of everything you are holding together. She thought about the 73 suitors, about the courtship chair, about the word complexities, repeated 73 times in 73 variations, each one a small, diplomatic way of saying your hand is broken, and so is your future. She held. She thought about Maylee's, about her sister's voice in the field hospital, calm and steady even as the beams groaned above them. "Stay low, Ale. Stay with me." About the sound of the collapse, not the explosion which had come first and was almost gentle, but the grinding, tearing, structural failure of a building dying around them. about Melis's hand reaching for hers in the dark, and the crossbeam falling between them, and the last thing Elindra felt before consciousness broke apart. Her sister's fingers touching hers, and then the pressure, and then nothing in her right hand ever again. She held. 4 hours. The iron spoke wore grooves into her palms, the left one would bruise, the right one barely registered new damage against the existing landscape of scars. Her forearms trembled, her shoulders locked, the water roared beneath her. When Vasik's voice came through the comm unit mounted on the control room wall, bypass off. We're sealed. You can release. Her hand did not want to let go. The muscles had locked around the spoke, cramped into a permanence that mimicked the scar tissue's own prison. She had to pry her fingers loose with her left hand, one by one, like picking a lock from the inside. She descended the 27 stairs to the channel. Vasik met her at the bottom, soaked to the chest, sealant on his hands and stone dust in his hair and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. His crew was behind him, the 2 Vethani workers and one of his human engineers, all of them leaning against the channel walls with the particular stillness of people who had just outrun a deadline. The fracture point was sealed. Crude work, beam stock and emergency sealant where reinforcement struts should have been, but sealed. The water flowed through the repaired channel in a steady, controlled stream, and the crack that had been widening by a millimeter a week was packed with compression compound that would hold through the winter and beyond. Vasik looked at her hands, both of them. The left one was merely tired, the palm red where the iron spoke had pressed. The right one was swollen, the scar tissue angry red, the fingers trembling with the aftermath of 4 hours of sustained grip that 3 years of medical assessments had said was impossible. He reached into his kit bag and pulled out a cloth wrap, standard issue engineering wrist support, the kind his crew used for repetitive strain. Without asking permission, without ceremony, without the careful diplomatic distance that every other person in her life maintained around the hand that was not supposed to work, he took her right hand in both of his and wrapped it. His hands were warm and rough and precise. The wrapping was tight enough to support without constricting, applied with the same unhurried care he brought to every structural repair, because to Cole Vasik, holding something damaged together was not a metaphor. It was the work. The valve was designed for 2 hands, he said. Yes. You held it for 4 hours. The math required it. Something happened in his eyes then. A shift, a deepening. The kind of recognition that lives below language, below diplomacy, below the careful architecture of courtship and protocol and alliance negotiation. He was still holding her wrapped hand in both of his, and neither of them moved to change that. The math, he repeated quietly. And in his voice, the word meant something it had never meant before, not calculation, not engineering, but the simple, structural truth of 2 people who had found each other in a corridor of stone while the mountain trembled around them. Elindra, who had watched 73 suitors look at her hand and leave, who had counted every departure from her balcony with the cold precision of someone tracking structural failures, who had pressed her damaged fist against stone walls and refused to break because breaking was a luxury the ascendancy's only heir could not afford, felt something crack open in her chest that was not pain, and was not grief, and was not the old familiar pride that had carried her through 3 years of refusals. It was the feeling of being seen, not inspected, not assessed for suitability, not pitied or avoided or diplomatically excused. Seen, the way Vasik saw a fracture in a wall clearly, fully, without flinching, and with the immediate practical understanding that what was cracked could still hold weight. She did not pull her hand away. The aftermath unfolded in both timelines simultaneously, the present rushing forward with the momentum of a mountain settling into its new shape, the past finally releasing its grip like a valve mechanism unlocking after years of compression. Draven's procurement audit was overruled by Elindra's mother, the ascendant Queen Nethara, who had been briefed on the near failure by Tessivar. The queen was ill, her strength failing by increments the same way the aqueduct's foundations had failed. But her mind was clear, and her fury at learning that a counselor's political maneuvering had nearly cost 11,000 lives. The ascendancy was treaty-bound to protect burned through the council chambers like the Korathi bombardment itself. The reinforcement struts arrived within 2 days. Vasik's crew installed them properly, replacing the emergency repairs with permanent structures rated for a century of mountain settlement. The aqueduct held through the winter. The 11,000 refugees drank clean water. The Kale Pass garrison maintained its supply line. And Councillor Draven, who had built his wall of small denials and redirected petitions on the assumption that a princess with a damaged hand would eventually accept diminished authority, watched the wall begin to crumble not from assault, but from irrelevance. Elindra did not confront him directly. That was not her way, and it would have given him the formal confrontation he was trained to win. She simply stopped routing through his office. Material requisitions, audience schedules, reconstruction priorities, refugee settlement approvals. She handled them herself, or through Tessivar, or through the growing network of engineers and laborers and settlement administrators who had learned that the first heir answered questions directly, made decisions based on structural data rather than political calculation, and did not care whether the person standing in front of her was Vethani or human or refugee or counselor, as long as their information was sound. Draven protested, Draven maneuvered. Draven convened a formal council session, full protocols, recorded proceedings. The traditional silver and gray banners of judicial review hung in the chamber, and argued, with the meticulous precision of a 30-year veteran of Vethani politics, that the first heir's judgment was being compromised by inappropriate proximity to a human contractor who had exceeded the scope of his engagement. The council listened. Some agreed. The species-mixing objection was ancient and comfortable, a well-worn piece of cultural architecture that required no new construction, only the invocation of old foundations. Draven wore it well, the way he wore everything, with formal precision, each word placed like a masonry block, the argument building toward a structure whose conclusion was predetermined. Elindra sat through the session with both hands on the council table, the good one and the scarred one, and waited for him to finish. She had learned patience from the courtship cycle, where endurance was the only strategy available to someone whose strongest argument was her continued presence. When Draven concluded, she pulled up the structural data Vasek had compiled over 4 months of work. The fracture analysis, the settlement patterns, the water flow projections, the soil compression readings, the thermal cycling models that had predicted the near failure 3 months before Draven's own engineers acknowledged the risk. She displayed it on the chamber's projection screen, cold, precise, inarguable. The human contractor's data saved 11,000 lives this winter, she said. Councillor Draven's procurement delay nearly ended them. I welcome the council's analysis of which judgment was compromised. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a structure everyone assumed was load-bearing turns out to be decorative. In the silence, Elindra felt the past timeline, the procession of 73 suitors, the courtship chair, the diplomatic murmurs about complexities, finally separate from the present and begin to recede. Not disappearing, never disappearing. The past was built into her the way the bombardment damage was built into the mountain, a permanent part of the geology, but receding. The way a mountain range recedes when you climb high enough to see the whole landscape, instead of just the narrow path you've been walking. The vote on Draven's motion to restrict Vasek's access failed 8-3. That evening, Elindra found Vasek in the aqueduct, as she often did now, checking the seals he had placed months ago, running his hands along the repaired sections with the attentiveness of a man who understood that maintenance was not a lesser act than construction. He did not know about the council session. He did not know about Draven's accusation. He was doing the work, the way he had done it every day since he arrived, precisely, without performance, because the math required it, and because the work was worth doing regardless of whether anyone was watching. "Draven tried to remove you today," she said. Vasek set down his inspection tool and looked at her. "Did it work?" "No." "Good." He picked the tool back up, then paused. "The secondary seal on fracture point 2 is showing early wear. I want to reinforce it before the spring melt adds pressure." Elindra leaned against the channel wall and watched him work. The overhead lights caught the gray in his hair and the old break in his jaw and the steadiness of his hands, and she thought about what recognition meant. Not the grand version, not the binding clasp on the coronation altar with the full court watching and the banners flying, but the daily version. The quiet, structural certainty of someone who showed up and did the work and saw you clearly and did not leave. "Cole." He looked up. She had never used his first name before. The sound of it in the stone corridor was different from how it would have sounded in a courtship chamber, less formal, more honest, like the difference between a surveyed diagram and the actual feel of a wall under your hand. "The council will ask about us," she said. "Draven will use it. Whatever this is between us, they'll frame it as leverage." "I know." The binding clasp requires 2 functional hands interlocked at the wrist. My right hand cannot perform it. The law is explicit. The council will say any union between us is ritually invalid. Vasek set down his tool for the second time. He straightened and faced her fully, the way he had faced her on the first day in her study, structurally, directly, without the diplomatic cushioning that most people placed between themselves and difficult statements. "I'm not interested in the ritual," he said. "I'm interested in the person." The ascendancy's law. The ascendancy's law says the clasp seals a union. It doesn't say the clasp is the only valid seal. It says it's the traditional one. Traditions are structures, and structures can be amended without being destroyed. You add a support beam. You redirect a load path. You keep the foundation and build something that actually fits the conditions. He paused, and something careful moved behind his eyes, not hesitation, but the deliberate choosing of words by a man who understood that words bore weight the same way structural members bore weight, and that careless language collapsed as surely as careless engineering. "You held a valve open for 4 hours with a hand everyone said couldn't hold anything. I watched you rebuild your own authority in a court that had written you off. If the law says the clasp is the only way, then the law is behind the facts. That's what laws do when the people outgrow them. They catch up, or they become irrelevant. Draven won't allow it. Draven isn't the mountain. He's the scree on the path. You clear scree by walking through it." Elindra looked at him, at his steady eyes and his broken jaw and his sealant-stained hands and his absolute, unbending, structural certainty that she was worth the fight. Not worth fighting for, that would have made her a prize. Worth the fight, meaning the fight itself was worth having because she was real and present and standing in front of him with both her hands visible and neither of them hidden. "You never asked about my hand," she said. "Your hand works," he said. "I watched it hold an iron valve for 4 hours, hold a council chamber in silence, and sign every authorization that kept this project alive. What else was there to ask?" In the memory palace of Elindra's dual timeline, that sentence would occupy its own room, small, stone-walled, lit by work lights, with water flowing steadily beneath the floor. The room where 73 departures finally stopped mattering, because one arrival had stayed. The amendment to the binding clasp law took 4 months of drafting, debate, and careful political construction. Elindra wrote the initial framework herself, with legal research from Tessavar, and she would never admit this publicly, though she suspected the council knew structural metaphors from Vasek that shaped the language in ways the traditional legal scholars would not have found on their own. The core principle was simple. The amendment recognized alternative sealing gestures for royal unions involving physical disability. Not an exception, not a gracious accommodation, but a full parallel legal track with equal standing and equal binding authority. Draven opposed it with everything he had. He marshaled the traditionalist bloc. He convened procedural hearings. He gave a 40-minute speech in full formal session about the sanctity of ancient ritual and the dangers of external influence on Vethani cultural law. And the speech was good, polished, historically grounded, emotionally resonant in the way that arguments for preservation always are when the thing being preserved has never cost the speaker anything. The vote was 11-4 in favor. Draven cast one of the 4 dissenting votes. He did it with his back straight and his silver hair impeccable and his expression controlled, and Elindra respected him for it, not for the position, but for the discipline of holding it cleanly when it had already lost. On the day of the ceremony, in the mountain courtyard where the Kale Pass opened onto the broad valley below, and the autumn light turned the granite walls to gold, Elindra stood across from Cole Vassic and performed the amended clasp. Instead of interlocking fingers, which her right hand could not do and would never do, she placed her damaged hand over his offered hand, palm to palm, her scarred fingers resting on his steady ones. The half fist against the open palm, the damaged against the whole, not interlocked but connected, not the old way but a way that was true. She pressed down, he held. The weight of the gesture was not in the grip. It was not in the fingers or the tendons or the scar tissue. It was in the choice, in the choosing to place the weakest, most damaged, most rejected part of herself into the hands of someone who had never once looked away from it, and finding that the hands held without flinching. The court watched from the tiered stone seats that lined the courtyard. Tessavar stood in the front row, her tablet for once set aside, her eyes bright. The ascendant Queen Nethara watched from her chair above, too ill to stand for the full ceremony, but present, her gaze clear and steady, her hand resting on the arm of the chair the way Elindra's hand rested on Vassic's. Draven stood at the back of the courtyard. His face was carefully neutral, the neutrality of a man already calculating his position in a court whose architecture had shifted beneath him. Elindra saw him, and felt nothing but the clean, structural clarity of a foundation that had finally settled. The refugees from the northern settlements lined the courtyard walls, not all 11,000, but enough. Enough to fill the spaces between the stone columns, enough to stand in the autumn light with their children and their bundles, and their faces turned toward a ceremony they had not been invited to, but had come to witness anyway, because the princess who had kept their water flowing was marrying the human who had climbed inside a mountain to fix it. Elindra did not count them the way she had counted the suitors leaving. She did not need to count arrivals. She only needed the one. Cole Vassic held her hand, the scarred one, the ruined one, the half-fist, the hand that 73 suitors had looked at and turned away from and called a complexity, and he held it the way he held everything. Steady, certain, without performance, without ceremony beyond what the moment structurally required. "The math works," he said quietly, and she heard what lived beneath the words, the structural certainty of a man who had measured every load-bearing wall in her kingdom and found none of them stronger than the woman standing in front of him. Elindra, first heir of the Vethani ascendancy, who had spent 3 years pressing a damaged fist against cold stone walls and refusing to break, felt her right hand relax in his grip. Not fully open, it would never fully open, and she had stopped needing it to. But more than it had managed in 3 years. The scar tissue stretched, the tendons eased, the half-fist softened into something that was not a fist at all but a hand resting in another hand, held without force, supported without pity, recognized without condition. She did not say, "I love you." The words were true but insufficient, too small for what they contained, the way a hairline crack is too small to show the forces moving through the stone beneath it. What she said was, The foundation holds. And Cole Vasek, 41 years old, stone dust perpetually under his fingernails, a jaw broken and healed off-center, dark eyes that assessed every room he entered for structural integrity, and found in this woman the strongest architecture he had ever encountered. Cole Vasek looked at the hand resting in his and said, "It always did." Above them, the mountain stood, bearing the weight of centuries and the fresh scars of war and the new repairs that human hands had sealed into ancient stone. Below them, water flowed through channels carved by masters and mended by engineers, carrying the cold clarity of snowmelt down to settlements where 11,000 people drank and lived and began again. Around them, a court that had measured a princess's worth by the opening of a fist learned, slowly, and with the reluctance of all old structures asked to bear new loads, to measure it by the strength of what held. The 73rd suitor had left before the sun crossed the courtyard wall. The 74th stayed.